Hey everyone, Heather Williams here from the California AfterSchool Network, as always, joined by Michael Funk from the California Department of Education, Expanded Learning Division, and we're here for another fireside chat. And today it'll just be Michael and I. We're excited to be sharing some updates on the recent California budget that was passed and trailer bills that were passed and all that good stuff. So lots of updates that impact our expanded learning program. So we're going to spend our time today kind of walking through all of that and giving you all some updates. And so before I jump into that, Michael, turning it over to you to say hello.
Thank you, Heather. Hi, everyone. First of all, it's hot, and we're aware of the fact that many of you are trying to run summer programs in excessive heat and are committed to do things for kids that they need in the summer. But we're just a moment of empathy for those that are doing that and doing it with high quality. I got some pictures today from Fresno Unified of their dive into space program, I think they call it. It's kids in scuba gear. That seems like a good place to be in the Central Valley heat, Heather. Um, anyway, so we're in the summer and we're coming through budget season. This fireside chat is going to be dedicated to walking through a lot of detail. And Heather will go into how you can even access more of that detail because you're not going to pick it up just by listening to this fireside chat. You'll want to have a reference that Heather will provide. So before I turn it to you, Heather, uh, I'm guessing our viewers are noticing a beautiful glow on your face. Why is that beautiful glow on your face, Heather?
Thanks, Michael. Yes, I am currently about to be 39 weeks pregnant in the wonderful heat that you referenced. And so Um, this will be, yeah, the last time I'm co-hosting a fireside chat for at least a few months, and so likely will be some other friendly faces from Cannes joining Michael for some fireside chats while I'm out with the new baby. Very excited to welcome and hopefully the next 10 days or so.
Well, congratulations.
Thanks, Mike.
And we'll keep the show must go on. The fireside chats will continue. We've already got some exciting guests lined up for in a few weeks from now. And so stay tuned. But Heather, I'll turn it back to you.
Great. Thanks, Michael. All right, so we're going to jump right in. As Michael said, it is a lot of content, a lot of detail, and so I'm going to share a screen, and this is a slide deck that we'll be sharing with you all, so you'll have access to view this. Again, like some of these slides, not the best format to do it, but there's a lot of text and content on each of these slides, but you'll have access to view the slide deck when you're watching this fireside chat and to go back and look at it later so you can kind of read through it and revisit any of these parts that you want to spend more time on. And we also have a policy newsletter that came out earlier this week that walks through very similar information. And so hopefully between these resources, the newsletter, the fireside chat, the slide deck, it'll help you to understand kind of all the different moving pieces that are happening. And so,
Hey,
uh,
Heather, one question. If someone's watching this fireside chat and they haven't received the policy newsletter, how can they receive that?
you can sign up for that on the CAN website, and I'll make sure that's linked in the fireside chat as well. If you're getting the fireside chats, you're probably already signed up for something, so you can go in and update your subscription preferences. And if you don't want to receive the policy newsletter, it only comes out a handful of times throughout the year, but you can also just access it directly on our website if you don't subscribe. So all those links will show up in the text of the description for this chat. So thank you. That's a good reminder. So this is one of those slides with a lot of information, and I'm definitely not going to read it all. But this is just kind of to remind you that the California legislature and the budget process is a year-long process. There's a lot going on every month. Right now we are in July. It's summer recess, and so the legislature did meet their deadline for signing the budget bill, and have signed additional budget trailer bills and all of that so that they could go on their summer recess. They will be back in session briefly in August. And so there's still some opportunities for legislation and follow-up budget cleanup as needed, but the bulk of the budget process really has been completed by that June 30th deadline. And then it'll be a little bit quiet this fall while folks are kind of navigating the campaign season and elections. And then once we hit December, January, we'll be off and running into the next budget session. But right now we've got a bit of a break, so time to dig into what was actually approved for the fiscal year 2024-25 budget. So the legislature and the governor, after lots of negotiation, came to agreement. They signed the Budget Act of 2024, which is AB 107. If you want to look at that budget bill, you can click on that link. You can read through the budget bill itself. The Budget Act is, or the main budget bill is really the main piece of legislation that outlines the dollars attached to programs. So in this Budget Act is where we see that the governor and the legislature, really maintain their commitment for education altogether, but especially expanded learning. And so we've talked about this in the past. It's been a bit of a challenging budget year, facing deficits, really having to figure out how to navigate that and put together a balanced budget, but really still maintaining commitment to schools and expanded learning. And so they maintained the $4 billion in ongoing funding for the Expanded Learning Opportunities Program, or ELOP, and then also continuing the commitment to the existing reimbursement rates for ACES and 21st century programs. And so if you're looking for, I really want to see the dollar amount that says that money's in there, you can click on the budget bill and look through that, but that is what is in the budget. So good news for our programs. Funding will remain consistent for this upcoming fiscal year. And as we go into some of the weeds of some of this other part of the budget, just elevating, not only do we see the commitment in this fiscal year, but there's a lot of indicators for really strong commitment for these programs to be permanent programs. There's lots of different policy pieces that really reinforce that folks want to see ELOP be successful, and we're not expecting any drastic shifts to funding anytime soon. Like, we really can expect this funding to remain stable. So getting into the weeds of some of that, we have budget trailer bills. So the Budget Act is the big budget bill, like I said, that includes the dollars that are associated with each program. But then the budget, whether it's the governor's proposed budget in January or the final budget or versions throughout, they outline changes to existing law. And so in order to implement the budget changes, then they have to kind of create these things they call budget trailer bills. And so they're organized by issue areas such as K-12, higher education, housing, et cetera. They kind of move through a similar but slightly different process. And so after the Budget Act is agreed upon, then there's some negotiation about the details through these trailer bills. And so we've been tracking the big trailer bill for K-12, which ended up being Senate Bill 153. Also, the Education Omnibus Budget Trailer Bill, you hear it referenced as a lot of different things. We're just going to call it the kind of K-12 trailer bill. The final PDF of the bill, I think, is almost 250 pages. It's a really lengthy bill, really lengthy legislation. It covers so many different things related to K-12 education, but it does include several impacts to expanded learning. And this was signed into law June 29th. And so that goes into effect immediately unless, and we'll go through this, it outlines other specific dates for programs to go into effect, but this is now law. So this makes changes to primarily education code, and as I said, has several impacts to expanded learning. So we're going to talk about ELOP expenditure deadlines, a new requirement for ELOP declaring intent to run, some changes to the rate 2 for ELOP, and then lastly, chatting a little bit about attendance recovery. And so we've talked about attendance recovery before, and attendance recovery programs have now officially gone into ed code. So we'll talk about the impacts to expanded learning. So updated ELOP expenditure deadlines, what already existed. So in past trailer bills, in legislation, it was clarified that ELOP apportionments for fiscal year 21-22 and 22-23 could be expended or encumbered by June 30th, 2024. So that date that just passed. Up until this trailer bill, it was recommended by CDE that funds encumbered by June 30th be expended by September 30th, 2024. The trailer bill, now that it's signed, basically officially requires it. So it was a CDE recommendation, now it's law, that those funds need to be expended by September 30th of this year, or they will be returned to the state. And then the final version of the trailer bill also noted that beginning with fiscal year 23-24, ELOP apportionments must be expended by June 30th of the following fiscal year. Any funds not expended by the end of that would be returned to the state. And so, that's a lot of dates and timelines. And so have this handy reference chart that clarifies so your apportionments and what the deadlines are. And so you'll see, right, starting, fiscal year 23-24, LEAs would have until June 30th, 2025 to expend those funds or the return to the state, and so on and so forth. And so as it's written, this doesn't end in fiscal year 24, 20 or 25, 26. The ... is just letting you know this is it continues on. So this is now the new expectation in terms of expending your apportionment within a certain time period.
So Heather, just not to be redundant, but just to say it in a different way, because sometimes people need to hear it in different ways. So what this means is the ELOP money for the fiscal year that just ended, you have until June 30th next year to spend it. Whatever you haven't spent from the fiscal year that just ended by June 30th next year, you will have to send back to the state.
Yep. And we'll talk a little bit more about what happens to that money when it gets returned to the state in just a moment. But another new piece that was outlined in this most recent version of the trailer bill and the signed trailer bill is this intent to run. So LEAs declaring their intent to run an ELOP. So this will begin in fiscal year 25-26. And so we are, for those of you tracking, we are currently in fiscal year 24-25. So this will be an expectation starting next fiscal year. And the legislation clarifies that CDE will provide the instructions and forms for this process. And that's pretty much it that's in the trailer bill. So it was very brief, very short language. And so there's still a lot to be developed. And we will be sharing out more information as more details are known. So we'll share that out in all of our different forums, fireside chats, office hours, newsletters, e-blasts, etc. from CAN. And then, of course, when there's official information, CDE will post that on their website and share that out via their e-blasts. So more information coming soon. We know there's a lot of questions about this. Um, and then just noting that to the extent possible, funds that are made available by LEA decisions not to operate an ELOP may be reallocated to rate 2 LEAs. And I'll jump into that a little bit more detail in a moment. But Michael, I want to turn it over to you to just talk about what does this mean, since your division is going to be probably put in charge of those instructions and
Yeah.
forms.
Yeah, so rate two, don't get hung up on that. Heather's going to that in the next couple of slides. I mean, to me, the bigger picture of what this really means is it signals the administration, and when we say administration, we're talking about the governor's office and departments under the governor's office, like the Department of Finance, which actually releases the trader bill. So the administration and the legislature are demonstrating by this that they're looking at this program from a long arc of time. Because what this bill really does is normally, so I just gave the example. Um, if a district for the last fiscal year that just ended, districts have until June 30th next year to spend the money. If a district, for whatever reason, which we wouldn't condone, has chosen not to spend the money, not to run a program, the state can't recoup that money until way down the road. And so what this, and you could imagine a scenario where with this kind of a budget deficit, that ELOP money that's not spent would go back and cover other things in the budget that are urgent or were not funded at the level that some people hoped. Well, what this says is ELO money that's not spent is in fact going back into ELOP programming. It doesn't have to do that. It didn't have to do that because this is not like ACES, where ACES funding in the state budget can only be spent on ACES. This ELOP funding, they could have repurposed the money that wasn't spent, but they have chosen not to. They've chosen to strengthen the rate two, and you'll understand more about that now or in just a few minutes. So to me, that's a clear signal that the legislature and the administration are interested in strengthening ELOP in every way possible. Because what this does is if for some reason the district says we're not going to run ELOP, we'll have that paperwork. And two things can happen. That could trigger and should trigger our system of support reaching out to that LEA and asking why and starting a conversation about, is there support that you need to do this, or can we help? Or there may be some misunderstandings. So, because what we want is the money to be spent to support kids and families, and it's just a tragic thing to me if an LEA has the opportunity to provide amazing opportunities for their community and families and their kids with this funding and choose not to. So, at a minimum, that declaration of intent not to run is going to trigger a conversation with that district, not to bully them but just to offer support, find out what's going on, and then if they still decide not to run, then that money goes back to the state right away instead of waiting another 2 years. So to me, there's lots of things about this that go beyond the details of implementation that's talk about the commitment to the program.
Thanks, Michael. So more information to come, but definitely the big takeaway is this is a good thing for ELOP. It will be strengthening our programs, and it definitely demonstrates commitment to ELOP. So with that, going to now transition to talking about rate twos. This is another slide that has a bunch of different information on it, and I'm not going to read it all, but it has technical details. So if you truly want to understand all the technicalities of this, you have access to this. But for many of you that have been in the weeds of ELOP or even are new to ELOP, you probably at this point realize that ELOP funding is currently organized into basically two rates based on an LEA's unduplicated pupil percentage, and there's a particular way that's calculated. That's all noted in here. But what we basically have is a tier one or rate one LEA, and that is one that has an unduplicated pupil percentage greater than or equal to 75%. And then tier two or rate two LEAs are those that are less than 75%. There's different offer and provide access requirements that are attached to that. But there's also a different funding calculation attached to that. And so the tier one or rate one has a set rate, and beginning in fiscal year 22-23, that was set at 2,750. And once that amount is figured out, so they figure out which LEAs fall into this rate, calculate that, see how much money that takes up of the $4 billion, and then whatever is left, they then identify what the rate is for rate two or tier two. And so in our most recent fiscal year, that ended up being $1,802 and some change, very specific change. And you can see, though, because of the way that's calculated, because unduplicate pupil percentage shifts every year, that the rate can fluctuate from year to year. And so we didn't really know until last year what that would look like. And we did see a pretty big difference between fiscal year 22-23 and fiscal year 23-24. And there's a lot of different things that impact that, increasing TK enrollment, just all sorts of different factors that we don't necessarily need to get into the weeds of, but important to see that between fiscal year 22-23 and 23-24, it was actually an over 12% decrease in that rate, which for some of our districts can be really challenging for planning purposes. You had a certain amount per student that you planned for one year, and then you find out kind of into the fiscal year what you're getting for the next year. And so we really recognize that the lack of stability in that funding can be challenging for districts in terms of planning. And so there's been a lot of conversation about this. I'll touch on the Marisucci bill in a moment that really kind of elevated this initially, but through the budget trailer bill and some of the pieces that I already talked about in terms of deadlines and declaring intent to run, there's a conversation about how do we provide more stability to rate two. So this is not, I will say upfront, is not the perfect solution and won't necessarily resolve all of the concerns about stabilization, but is the first attempt to look at how we bring more stability to rate two. And so as we talked about in the expenditure deadlines section, those apportionments from fiscal years 21-22 and 22-23 now must be expended by September 30th of this year. And those funds returned, not spent, returned to the state. And so the state will then have the opportunity, whatever funds were returned, to try to get rate two up to $2,000 per student. If there's not enough funding, the superintendent can prorate that amount based off of what is available, but the hope is to get it up to $2,000. And then beginning in 25-26, as LEAs have to annually declare their intent to run an ELOP that we just talked about, those funds made available and returned to the state are to be reallocated to rate two to, again, try to offer some stability to that. So again, recognizing because of timing and because we don't know exactly how much will be returned to the state. And of course, we're trying to still really encourage folks not to return money to the state, to spend it on their students. We don't know exactly how this will play out, but this is the first attempt to bring some stability to rate two. So that doesn't mean the work to bring rate stabilization is done. And that does bring me back to AB 2112, which is Newly introduced legislation this year, sponsored by San Diego Unified, who's a rate 2 district, to address those concerns. And so initially the bill talked about setting rates at a particular dollar amount that was removed back in June, because some of this was being addressed through the trailer bill process. But what remains in the bill is asking CDE to convene stakeholder work groups and provide recommendations by November 1st, 2025, next year. So next year on a number of topics. The first topic is rate stabilization. So even this legislation acknowledges there still needs to be ongoing conversations about rate stabilization. And then also looking at other aspects of ELOP that really need to be examined to provide a high quality expanded learning program. So best practices, looking at how one comprehensive programs offer with ACES in 21st century, what's truly the cost of quality, so on and so forth. So there's a number of expectations for this bill. It is still moving through the legislative process. A lot of bills kind of got put on hold while the budget was finalized. And so once the legislature comes back in August, they'll be picking up a lot of this legislation. And this has been moving through the process quite quickly, and everybody voting yes on it. And so we kind of expect it to continue through the process. And we'll know by the end of August if this officially gets through the legislative process. But right now we don't have any indication that it wouldn't make it through. So, Michael, I think now's a good time to pause and see what else you want to say and add on.
Yeah, just in the interest of time, I'm going to be fairly quick on this because we've covered a lot of ground and you've been listening for quite a while. What I want to say about this bill is similar to what I made the comment about the intent to run, is the fact that they're identifying several things that need to be addressed to strengthen the program and asking stakeholders or interest holders in the field and CDE to facilitate a process. So to engage interest holders from across the state and to not have a due date until November 2025 to make the recommendations. That again is an indication of the state of California is looking at this through a long arc of time on how to make this strong and improve it. We will be, the legislation talks about existing work groups or creating new work groups. Bottom line is we have certain work groups that have been meeting. We have already a statutorily created before and after school advisory committee. We have the research and evaluation strategy committee. People who are currently on that committee have committed to serve until the end of this calendar year. There'll be more openings for people to step up and say they'd like to be involved. So there's likely to be a way, if you're interested, for your voice to be part of this process. We'll also be going to various parts of the state to meetings that are already being called and coming in to get feedback on these items. So I think that's where I'll hold it there, Heather, on this bill.
Right. All right. So coming down to the end, but this is a big one. So attendance recovery programs. This was introduced in earlier versions of the trailer bill at the start of the year. And we know there's been a lot of questions, and will this even be a thing? It's a thing. It's officially a thing now. So we do have attendance recovery programs. And I'll talk about, I'm not going to read through all of these bullet points, but just highlighting that some of what was in the original proposal still exists. It's optional, right? This is optional for districts to run it. They don't have to. And participation in the program is voluntary. So even if a district runs a program, students and parents have to opt into this program. Given the nature of them, and if you're interested, you can go back and look at old Fireside chats where we kind of talk more in detail about this. But given the nature of them, they're operated before or after school, on weekends, during intersession, etc. When our expanded learning programs operate. So that means that they can be included as a component during ACES, 21st Century Assets, or ELOP programs. Or it could be run completely separately if you're not using one of those funding sources. There is no additional funding for this, so districts would be running this with existing funding. They could leverage some of their expanded learning funding. They could use other LCFF funding. It's up to the district. But this doesn't otherwise change expanded learning requirements. So if you're offering expanded learning program and you're integrating attendance recovery into it, it doesn't mean you get to opt out of all the other requirements of an expanded learning program. This just gets to be a component, some other pieces in here. And of course, there will be guidance provided by CDE on this, which needs to be posted by June 30th, 2025, so next year. But there was some very intentional language that made some shifts to the program or added some clarity to the program. So it is now clear that implementation of attendance recovery would not begin until July 1st, 2025. So CDE will release its guidance, and then districts can then begin to implement the program. It cannot result in a student being credited for more than 10 days of attendance. I highlight this because, or up to the number, if a student missed 5, they can only recover 5 days, for example. But the original proposal talked about 15 days. So just wanted to highlight this is a thing that shifted. It went from 15 days to 10 days. The initial proposal also talked about that ADA could be generated in 15-minute increments, and the final language talks about 1-hour increments instead. And more specifically for expanded learning, there's additional language that was added because there's a lot of questions about attendance recovery, and is this going to negatively impact our expanded learning programs? And so that was not the intent from the beginning, but they really wanted to clarify that language throughout. And so they made that clear with some of the wording that there should not be, that fiscal impacts to expanded learning programs are minimized and pupil access to expanded learning programs are expanded. So if anything else, this should expand access to programs. And clarifying, right, that if you use ELOP funds to support attendance recovery programs, they need to be operated in conjunction. Again, this can't, if you're using ELOP dollars, you can't run a separate attendance recovery program. This needs to be integrated in a component of the program. So still a lot more to come, and there's a lot more detail in the actual trailer bill. So if you want to kind of read and get into the weeds of that, I recommend looking at the final language that was approved, but there will be much more guidance coming from CDE before this is expected to be implemented. So I'm going to stop sharing and see, Michael, if you want to say anything about attendance recovery before we start to wrap up.
I'm good. You did a great job.
Great. So just noting, there is some other pending legislation that folks have been tracking that impacts expanded learning because it wasn't tied to the budget process. Again, it's kind of been put on hold, but for those of you that have been tracking the McCarty bill, AB 1113, that was introduced last session around data collection. A new version of that hasn't been released, but we're expecting that to be released in August once the legislature is back in session, that talks about data collection. And so there's been a lot of conversations internally at CDE and through the Research Evaluation Strategy Committee and other groups about how do we collect data for ELOP. And so there will definitely be more to come on that. So be on the lookout for that. And Michael, just turn it over to you if you want to say something briefly about
Yeah,
that.
well, I'm not going to say much because until the bill's released, that would be premature, but we've been deeply involved in the conversations and the dialogue. We've held several things to be important. A, the data has to be meaningful to those that run the programs as well as those that fund the programs. for quality improvement and for validation. The data collection should not be cumbersome and add a really heavy lift to local educational agencies or the department. And the data should be useful to leverage other types of data. So we've been holding those things as really important elements that whatever's done should make sure that that's the reality. And I think we're on a good path. So stay tuned.
Yeah. So lots of stuff that has come out through this budget process, a lot of things for folks to track and follow and know, but a lot more information to come. And then, like I said, in August, a couple more updates on legislation as those move through the last bit of that process. So more to come. Stay tuned. Folks probably have a lot of questions. We have a lot of questions, so there will be a lot more information to come, but hopefully this helps answer some questions in the meantime. So with that, thank you, Michael, for joining, and I think we'll log off for now, and I'll see everybody in a few months. Michael, any closing comments?
Yeah, I'll just say earlier today, Heather and I were both participating in ELOP office hours and just heard so many rich examples of uh, people who are doing really amazing things for kids in their communities, just things they could have never done without ELOP and things that took imagination and a bit of courage. And it was just inspiring. So thank you for all you're doing out there. Heather, the next time we'll see you on a chat, maybe you'll have something in your arms.
Special guest appearance, yes.
Special guest. Our first guest when she comes back will be her own. Anyway, thanks for all you're doing out there, everyone. Heather, thank you, and we'll miss you. Come back soon, and everyone lead with love. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael.